2 months pregnant, my husband thumbed out divorce papers, forced me to sign, then kicked me out and told me to get an abortion. Hi, welcome to my channel. Here's my new story.
She cries too much, I can't work. I'm going to Europe, my husband said. Then he left me and our newborn child in the house that used to be ours. I completely broke down. But when I discovered the truth, he wasn't going to seek opportunities. He had sold what was in my name, drained my accounts, and disappeared. I was left numb with pain. The only time he came back was the day he was arrested. Welcome to this story, one inspired by social themes that carry a meaning far deeper than the surface. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. And now, let's go back to the beginning. 11 at night, a 3-week-old baby in my arms, and a phone call I never expected. The house was quiet the way only a new mother understands quiet, not peaceful, but suspended. Every sound carried weight. The baby monitor on the nightstand. The particular silence that meant Nell was breathing steadily for now. I was in the armchair by the window, Nell tucked against my chest, 3 weeks old and already full of opinions. I had opinions too, mostly about sleep and how long it had been since I'd had any. That was when my phone rang. The number wasn't saved. Philadelphia area code, nothing I recognized. Nell stirred at the vibration. I answered before she could fully wake. Ms. Hale. The voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. My name is Edmund Drummond. Catherine Wexler at the Penn Museum gave me your contact. I hope the hour isn't entirely unreasonable. It was 11 at night. The hour was entirely unreasonable. But Catherine Wexler was one of the most respected Provenance scholars on the East Coast, and people like her didn't hand out phone numbers carelessly. "What can I do for you, Mr. Drummond?" I asked. He described the painting the way collectors describe things they aren't entirely sure about precisely, but not completely. A large format oil on canvas, early 20th century, in character European provenance. He had acquired it through a private intermediary 6 months prior. He wanted a full independent appraisal documentation review, material analysis condition report. The fee he offered was more than I charged for a month of standard work. I told him I could begin within the week. What I didn't tell him was that I would have agreed for considerably less. For the better part of a year, Conrad had been quietly restructuring our household finances accounts. I had contributed to expenses I had planned around, all gradually reorganized in ways that were difficult to argue with individually and impossible to ignore entirely. Every time I brought it up, he had a reasonable explanation. Reinvested, consolidated, simplified. I had a 3-week-old daughter and a skill set that commanded real money in the right market. Taking this commission wasn't ambition, it was arithmetic. My name is Josephine Hale. Before Nell, before any of this, I was the woman people called when a painting needed to tell the truth. Independent art appraisal sounds like quiet work. It isn't. It is the work of reading objects the way other people read faces, looking for small betrayals, the inconsistencies a surface is designed to conceal. I had spent 12 years learning how to look at beautiful things and find what was underneath. I worked from the study on the second floor of our home in Chestnut Hill, surrounded by reference text, a professional imaging system, and more magnification equipment than most small museums owned. I built that practice myself. I was good at it. Drummond's crate arrived the following morning, double-sealed, climate-controlled, with the kind of courier documentation that indicated genuine care for what was inside. Walter was in the kitchen when it came. My father had driven up from Wilmington the week Nell was born, and simply stayed the way he handled most things, without announcement, making himself useful in the quiet way of someone who understood that showing up mattered more than explaining why. He helped me carry the crate upstairs. It was heavier than I expected, not dramatically, so not the kind of weight that made you set it down and reconsider, but heavier than a canvas of its stated dimensions should have been in the specific way that made a part of my mind file a small, wordless note and move on. I had been doing this long enough that my hands knew things before my brain caught up with them. I noted the weight. I did not stop to examine the note. Walter held the door while I maneuvered the crate through. In the living room, our neighbor Odette held Nell and delivered a running commentary on the squirrels in the oak tree outside, which Nell regarded with the intense focus of someone taking detailed notes. Conrad came home at noon. He stood in the study doorway for a moment, watching me sort through the documentation files. Then he crossed the room and pressed a kiss to the side of my head. "You look like you again," he said. It was exactly the right thing to say. He always knew exactly the right thing. "Don't let me forget the intake forms by Thursday," I said. "I'll put it in the calendar." He squeezed my shoulder once and left me to work. The painting had presence. It was larger than Drummond's description had implied, and it held a quality that certain works carry, the kind that changes the weight of a room simply by being in it. The subject was a woman at a window rendered in layered oil glazes, in a style that sat at the edge of the late Symbolist period. Technically accomplished, formally precise. The documentation traced a provenance trail through a private Austrian collection, sold in the early 90s, then quiet for 3 decades before surfacing at a European dealer. I worked through the standard protocol: surface examination under raking light, ultraviolet scan for restoration work, infrared imaging of the underdrawing. The stretcher bar, the canvas weaved the signature in the lower right corner. All of it consistent, all of it appropriate, all of it exactly right. By 9 that evening, Walter had made dinner. I forgot to eat it. Odette had put Nell down for what she called a solid stretch. Conrad had gone to bed with the quiet patience of a man who had learned that asking when I was coming to bed never ended the way he hoped. I picked up my loupe. The high magnification one, the kind that makes a canvas stop being a painting and start being a surface. I moved slowly across the upper register methodical background first. Then I reached the lower left corner, where the edge of the woman's dress met the floor. I stopped, moved the loupe back, looked again. The brush stroke was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not the kind of wrong that shows up under UV or in the provenance documents. Wrong in the way that only reveals itself when you are close enough, patient enough, and trained enough to see it. A mark made by a different hand in a different moment with a different intention. Invisibly wrong. And in my line of work, invisibly wrong is the most dangerous kind of wrong there is. The following night, I went back to the painting. Odette had offered to stay late again. She said she didn't mind that she'd bring her book, that Nell was good company, even when Nell wasn't doing anything in particular. I told her I just needed a few hours. She set herself up in the armchair in the nursery and waved me off without looking up from her page. I closed the study door and stood in front of the canvas for a moment before I touched anything. 12 years in this work had taught me one reliable truth. When something feels wrong, the feeling is almost always ahead of the evidence. The evidence catches up. It always does. You just have to be patient enough to wait for it. I wasn't going to rush this. I started with the infrared imaging system, a full pass slow, and even letting the camera read what the eye couldn't reach. Infrared cuts through the surface layers of paint and shows what's underneath the underdrawing. The preparatory marks the bones of a composition before it becomes a painting. Every artist has a way of beginning. Those early marks are as individual as handwriting. What I saw made me set the camera down and look again. The underdrawing did not match the painting above it. Not in the way that artists change their minds mid-work, shifting a figure's arm, repositioning a horizon line. Those changes have a logic to them, a conversation between what was planned and what was made. What I was seeing was something else. The marks below the surface belonged to a different composition entirely. Different subject, different spatial logic, different hand. The canvas had not been modified, it had been reused. I moved to the cross-section analysis, next a painstaking process of reading the paint layers from the edge of the canvas inward, like reading the rings of a tree. It took the better part of 2 hours. When I had the data I needed, I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. A palimpsest. The word comes from the manuscript tradition, a parchment that had been scraped clean and written over the original text, still faintly legible beneath the new one. In the art world, it happens. Canvases were expensive. Artists reused them. It wasn't inherently unusual, but this was not an artist reusing a canvas out of thrift. The preparation work was too deliberate, the covering layers too carefully constructed. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make the surface above look complete, permanent, finished, as if nothing had ever existed beneath it. Someone had hidden something here. I did not yet know what. I drafted the report in the careful, measured language I used for professional correspondence, documenting what the imaging showed, what the layer analysis confirmed, what conclusions the evidence supported and which ones it didn't. I was precise about the distinction. I always was. An appraiser who overstates her findings loses the one thing that makes her findings worth anything. I sent it through my professional account, the one I had maintained separately from any shared system since I first went independent, because client confidentiality required it. Drummond's contact address was already in my records from the intake documentation. The report went out at 11:47. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I was powering down the screen when I heard the door. Conrad was standing in the doorway, half in shadow in the old gray t-shirt he slept in. He looked like he'd been awake for a while or hadn't quite gotten there yet, that particular unreadable quality he had when he was tired. "Still at it," he said quietly. "Just finishing up." He leaned against the doorframe. "What are you working on?" "Just checking something on the Drummond file," I said. Routine. He nodded the way he nodded when he wasn't particularly interested in the details, which in fairness was most of the time. Art documentation wasn't his world. He'd never pretended otherwise. He crossed the room, pressed his lips to my forehead. "Don't work too late," he said. "I won't." He left. I listened to his footsteps down the hallway, the soft sound of the bedroom door closing, and then the house was quiet again. I stood there for a long time after he left, holding my phone, trying to name the feeling in my chest. I could not. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't worry. It was something formless and low, the kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself clearly enough to be addressed. It just sits there underneath everything else, like a mark beneath a layer of paint. I told myself it was just exhaustion. New mothers are always exhausted. I turned off the light and went to bed. Morning came in slowly the way it did those early weeks, not with an alarm, but with Nell. She had been awake since 5, cycling through the particular sequence of sounds she used to communicate a comprehensive range of needs, all of which translated, as far as I could tell, to the same thing: I am here, and I require your full attention. By 7, we had both settled into an uneasy truce. She was in the bouncer on the kitchen floor. I was standing at the counter with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring at nothing in particular. Conrad came downstairs already dressed, which surprised me. He usually worked from home on Thursdays. He spotted the appointment reminder on the whiteboard by the fridge, the 6-week postpartum checkup I had rescheduled twice already, and turned to look at me with an expression I recognized. The one that meant he had already decided something and was about to present it as a question. "Let me drive you both," he said. "I want to be there." "You don't have to, Josephine." He said my name the way he said it when he wanted me to stop deflecting. "Let me drive you." He was already picking up Nell from the bouncer, settling her against his shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 3 weeks figuring out the precise angle that kept her calm. She grabbed a fistful of his collar and held on. He looked at me over the top of her head. I said yes. The clinic was on Germantown Avenue, 15 minutes from the house on a good traffic morning. Conrad found parking on the first try, which he announced with the quiet satisfaction of a man who considered this a personal achievement. He carried the diaper bag. He held the door. He sat in the waiting room chair beside me with Nell in his arms and talked to her in a low voice about the fish tank across the room, narrating each fish's probable personality with complete seriousness. I watched him and felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing it was there. This was the version of Conrad I had married. Steady. Present. The kind of man who drove you to appointments you kept rescheduling and sat in waiting rooms without checking his messages. The appointment itself was routine. My doctor asked the standard questions, noted that I was healing well, reminded me that postpartum fatigue was real and that I should be asking for more help than I probably was. I said I had good people around me. She said that was the right answer. The whole time, a small part of my mind was back in the study on the second floor. The imaging data, the underdrawing, the layered paint that didn't belong to the composition above it. I had sent Drummond the preliminary report, but there was more to do. Additional cross-referencing, a deeper look at the provenance documents. Questions I hadn't fully formed yet, but could feel taking shape. The work had its own gravity. It always did. Conrad caught me somewhere in the middle distance on the drive home. "You're thinking about the painting," he said. It wasn't a question. He knew my distracted face the way you know someone's distracted face after 4 years of marriage. "Occupational habit," I said. He smiled at the road. "You can head straight upstairs when we get back. I'll get Nell settled. You have calls this afternoon. Nothing that can't shift." He glanced over at me briefly. "Go do your work, Josephine." I did not know sitting in that car that Conrad had already made other arrangements for the afternoon. I did not know that the moment I climbed the stairs to my study and settled Nell into her bassinet, a sequence of events would begin in the rooms below me that I would not understand for weeks. I did not know that the painting I had spent 3 days examining, the one that had been keeping its secrets in the way that objects sometimes do, would not be the same painting by the time the sun went down. I did not know any of this. I was thinking about brushstrokes. I went upstairs. The study was exactly as I had left it. Door-pulled, halfway closed imaging equipment powered down the Drummond documentation stacked on the left side of the desk. I set Nell's bassinet in the corner and transferred her into it while she was still drowsy from the car. She settled without protest. I stood at the edge of the room and looked at the canvas. It looked the same. Of course it looked the same. And yet, my hands knew things before my brain caught up with them. That was what 12 years in this work had given me. Not certainty, not evidence, just a low and wordless signal that operated below the threshold of conscious thought. Something in the room had a quality I could not name, not visual, not auditory. More like the feeling of a conversation in which you have just learned that the person across from you has been keeping something back. The words are the same. The face is the same, but the meaning of everything has shifted slightly. I stood there for longer than I should have. Then Nell made a small sound from the bassinet, not distress, just presence. Just "I am here," and I turned away from the canvas and went to her. I told myself I was reading too much into it. The painting looked exactly as I had left it. I picked up Nell and walked away. I would not understand what I had felt in that moment until much later, when it was far too late to matter. I noticed his side of the wardrobe first. Not because I was looking, I wasn't. I was moving through the morning the way I moved through every morning that week on autopilot carrying Nell from the nursery, while my brain ran 4 steps behind my body. I set her on the bed to change her, reached for the drawer with the spare burp cloths, and my eyes drifted to the wardrobe door hanging open an inch. I pushed it fully open. His side was empty. Not reorganized, not packed for a trip. Empty in the way that means someone made decisions without you. The good suits were gone. The weekend bag. The shoes on the upper shelf. A pale rectangle on the wood where his watch case had sat for 4 years. I stood there looking at that rectangle. Then my phone rang. He called from a New York number. He was already there. "I should have told you sooner," he said in the tone of a man who has rehearsed a sentence until the meaning has been completely wrung out of it. "There's a position at a firm on Park Avenue Estate and art law at a level Philadelphia can't offer. It made sense to move quickly. When were you going to tell me?" "I'm telling you now." I sat on the edge of the bed, Nell against my shoulder. "Conrad, we have a 5-week-old daughter." A pause. Measured, precise. "I'm aware." "Are you?" "Josephine." That tone, the one he used to close a subject. "You're suited for this. The home, the baby, the routine. You always have been. You have your father, you have Odette. You don't need me standing around the house watching you manage everything just fine without me. Watching you manage everything just fine. As if my being capable was the reason he could leave without guilt. And my work," I said, "the Drummond Commission." He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something that lived between dismissal and boredom. Josephine, you assess paintings in a room upstairs. It's a nice thing to do. But let's not pretend it's a career that needs protecting. I kept my voice even. Nell was watching my face. And her eye said, "What about Nell?" Another pause. Longer this time. "She cries constantly," he said. "You know that, right? I haven't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 5 weeks. I can't work. I can't think. I can't have a single conversation in that house without being interrupted by..." He stopped himself. Reset. When he spoke again, his voice was smooth, controlled. "I need to be somewhere I can actually function. You understand that?" I understood something. I wasn't sure it was what he meant. He moved on to logistics. Someone would collect his remaining things. Financial arrangements would be handled professionally. He used that word twice. The second time, I stopped listening to the content and started listening to the structure, the prepared transitions, the careful sequencing. This was not a difficult conversation for him. He had organized it like a brief. The call ended with a summary and a silence that meant he had already moved on before I had finished processing the first sentence. Nell had fallen asleep against my shoulder somewhere near the end of the call. Her weight was warm and complete the specific heaviness of a sleeping infant who has decided without reservation that you are the safest place in the world. I sat with her for a while without moving. Then I opened my business laptop. My hands were steady. I noted that separately the way you notice small things when the large things are still too shapeless to hold. I typed the login credentials for the business account, the one I had built over 3 years of independent work commission by commission. The balance took a moment to load. I read it 3 times. The credit line, $380,000 drawn down entirely. One line item in the transaction record equipment purchase. Authorization on file. Dated 7 months prior. Signature on record mine. I pulled up the authorization document, found the scanned signature page, my name, my handwriting, dated and witnessed. I sat very still. The memory surfaced without drama. An ordinary Tuesday in early spring. 3rd trimester, full body exhaustion, standing at the kitchen stove, heating formula. Conrad had come in with his tablet, held it out, said, "Just a routine insurance update," and pointed to the signature line. I had signed without reading a single word. I had trusted him completely. That was my mistake. I don't know how long I sat on the kitchen floor. Nell was in my lap, awake and quiet in the way she sometimes was, not content exactly, but still as if she could sense that the usual rules were suspended. The phone was on the tile beside me, screen still showing the account balance. $847. The business credit line gone. My signature on the authorization. I looked at those numbers until they stopped meaning anything. Then I called my father. He picked up on the second ring. "Dad." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I need you to come." A pause. Not hesitation, just Walter registering the weight of what I wasn't saying. "I'm on my way," he said. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask how bad it was. He just said those 4 words, and I heard movement in the background keys, a door, and the line went quiet. I set the phone down and looked at Nell. "Okay," I said to her, which wasn't really directed at her at all. Odette appeared at the back door 20 minutes later with a canvas bag over one arm and the expression of a woman who had assessed a situation from a distance and arrived with exactly the right supplies, formula, diapers, a container of soup she said she'd made 2 days ago and I should eat it regardless. She set everything on the counter without asking permission, filled the kettle, and turned to look at me, still on the floor. "Up," she said not unkindly. "You can fall apart sitting in a chair just as well." I got up. She took Nell while I moved to the table and she talked, while she warmed the formula about nothing in particular, about the neighbor's oak tree losing another branch in last night's wind, about a delivery she'd been waiting on for 2 weeks that had finally arrived at the wrong address. She talked the way people talk when they understand that silence right now would be the wrong kind of company. I let her. Walter arrived 40 minutes after the call. He came through the front door, set his jacket on the hook the way he always did, and came directly to the kitchen. He looked at me for a moment, a long reading look, the kind that takes inventory, and then he put the kettle back on because Odette's tea had gone cold, and he sat down across from me. "Tell me," he said. So I told him. Not everything not in order, but the shape of it. Conrad's call, the empty wardrobe, the $380,000 drawn from the business account 7 months ago, while I was standing at this same stove heating formula, signing something I didn't read because I trusted the man who handed it to me. Walter listened without interrupting. That was one of his particular qualities, the ability to hold space for a thing without trying to fix it before you'd finish saying it. When I stopped talking, he was quiet for a moment. Then, Odette said from the counter, "He did what?" $380,000, I said. "From your business account." With my signature. She turned around, looked at me, looked at Walter. "That man came into this house and held that baby," she said, with a precision that made it worse somehow than if she had simply shouted. Walter put both hands around his mug. "Did you know he had access to that account?" "He had power of attorney over the business documentation. I set it up during the 3rd trimester so someone could handle paperwork if I was unavailable." I heard how it sounded as I said it. "He was my husband." "I know," Walter said. I thought, "I know Josephine." The kitchen went quiet except for Nell making small sounds in Odette's arms. Then Walter said carefully, as if he were placing something fragile on a table, "Your mother went through something like this. Not the same, but the same kind of alone." He paused. "She never told you that." I looked at him. He was looking at his tea. "Isadora dealt with it by herself. Thought she could manage without pulling anyone else in." He glanced up briefly. "It didn't go well for her." I had questions more than I could organize in that moment. My mother had moved to Lancaster when I was in college, and we'd spoken less and less over the years until speaking became something that happened on birthdays and felt formal and brief. I had told myself that was just how some families worked. I had told myself a lot of things. "What kind of alone?" I said. Walter shook his head slightly. "That's her story to tell, not mine." He wrapped both hands around his mug again. "I'm just saying. Don't do what she did." The painting had been sitting in the back of my mind through all of it, not forgotten, just set aside the way you set aside something you know you'll have to return to. By mid-afternoon, with Nell asleep in the bassinet and Odette washing dishes and Walter reading in the armchair in the living room, I went upstairs to the study. I stood in front of the canvas for a full minute. Then I called Drummond. He answered on the 3rd ring. I didn't let him speak first. "Mr. Drummond," I said. "I need to tell you something about the painting. The canvas has been reused. There's an older work underneath it. I can see it in the underdrawing. I sent you a preliminary report 2 nights ago, but I want to say it directly. This painting is a palimpsest. Someone covered something deliberately. I don't know what is underneath yet, but I will. And I need to know, did you have any reason to suspect this before you commissioned me?" The silence on the other end was the particular kind that means someone is choosing their next words very carefully. "Miss Josephine," he said finally, "how much do you know about where this painting came from? Only what is in the documentation you provided." Another silence, longer. "I see," he said. And then, "I owe you an explanation. Not over the phone. Can you come to the gallery tomorrow morning?" The gallery was on 5th Avenue in Manhattan, not Philadelphia, which I hadn't realized until I was already on the highway with Nell in the car seat behind me and the GPS recalculating for the 3rd time. Drummond had mentioned the gallery in passing during our first call, and I had assumed it was local. I had assumed a lot of things lately that turned out not to be true. It was a 2-hour drive. Nell slept for most of it. I did not. The building was narrow and understated from the street, the kind of place that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. A brass plate beside the door read Drummond Fine Arts Established, 1987. No window display, no signage beyond the plate. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with Nell's carrier strapped to my chest looking at the door, and then I went in. Drummond was waiting just inside. No receptionist at the front desk. No staff visible anywhere in the long, quietly lit main room. He was dressed simply dark trousers, a gray jacket, and he looked older in person than his voice had suggested. He had the particular stillness of someone who had learned over many decades not to waste movement. He looked at Nell for a moment before he looked at me. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Please follow me." The back room was not what I expected. Not a storage space, not an office in the conventional sense, more like a room that had been arranged for thinking. A long table, 2 chairs, a single painting on the far wall that I recognized immediately as a genuine early period work by an artist whose name most people would know. He caught me looking at it. "A gift," he said without elaborating. "Sit down, Miss Josephine." He set a cup of coffee in front of me and one in front of himself and opened a folder on the table between us. "Your encrypted report arrived safely," he said. "I want you to know that first. Everything you sent me is secure." "But," I said. He turned a page in the folder. 3 days after your report was sent, a legal transaction was initiated under your name through an estate and art law firm registered in Philadelphia. He slid a document across the table. Authorization for international transport. Export clearance issued under your professional license number. The paperwork is clean on the surface. I looked at the document. My name. My professional license number. A signature that was close enough to mine that anyone unfamiliar with my actual handwriting would not have questioned it. "Conrad's firm," I said. Drummond nodded once. "What was transported?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "That is the part I cannot tell you with certainty." He folded his hands on the table. "Through my network, I was made aware that a work has appeared in London at Christie's entered into a private sale. The documentation attached to it carries your credentials. Your name, your license, your professional certification." He paused. "Whether it is the painting currently in your study or another work entirely that has been legitimized using your identity, I do not yet know." I sat with that for a moment. "You think someone used my paperwork," I said, "to move something through channels it couldn't travel through on its own?" "I think," Drummond said carefully, "that your professional identity was used to give a transaction the appearance of legitimacy. The painting in your study, with its palimpsest with whatever exists beneath that surface, may have nothing to do with what is in London, or it may have everything to do with it." "Ah," he looked at me steadily. "What I know is that your name is on documents you did not sign, attached to a work you did not certify. That is what I can tell you with certainty." I looked at the document again, the signature line, my name in someone else's hand. "Mr. Drummond," I said, "every piece of paper in that folder points to me. The transport authorization, the export clearance, presumably the sale documentation as well." I looked at him directly. "Why didn't you sue me?" He set down his coffee cup. The pause that followed was deliberate, the pause of a man who had decided exactly what he was going to say and was taking the time to say it correctly. "I knew your mother," he said. The room was very quiet. "Isadora," he said. "I knew her not well and not recently, but at a particular moment in my life she did something for me that I have never forgotten." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at me. When I looked at what was in front of me, the documents, the timeline, the way this had been arranged, I saw the shape of something deliberate. And I thought of Isadora. And I thought that the woman who raised her daughter to do this work with this precision was not the kind of woman whose daughter would do what these papers suggested. I said nothing. I was not entirely sure I was breathing. "I could be wrong," Drummond said with the quiet candor of someone who knew he wasn't. "I have been wrong before. But I have been in this business for nearly 40 years, and I have learned to trust the instinct that tells me when a frame has been constructed around an innocent person." He looked at me steadily. "That is what I believe happened here." "What was it?" I said. "What did my mother do for you?" He shook his head slightly, not a refusal, more a deferral. "That is a longer conversation. One I would like to have with you, but not today. Today I need you to understand the situation clearly." He reached into the folder again and produced a second document, a Provenance Summary International in scope, with several entries highlighted. "The work in London has been entered into a private auction," he said, "under your name. The estimate is substantial." He paused. "There are also irregularities in the original acquisition documentation. I provided you things I did not notice until after I received your report. Details that suggest the person who sold me this painting may have known exactly what they were doing." I looked at the document, then at him. "You think this was planned?" I said. "I think," Drummond said carefully, "that certain things have happened in a very particular sequence. And when things happen in a very particular sequence, it is worth asking who benefits from that sequence." He picked up his coffee cup again, turned it once in his hands. "I do not have answers. I have an accumulation of questions that I find troubling." He looked at me for a long moment. "Your mother had her career dismantled 8 years ago," he said quietly. "The circumstances where I always found them difficult to accept. And now you are sitting across from me with your name on documents you did not sign connected to a painting that came to me through channels I cannot fully account for." He set the cup down. "I may be wrong. I want to be clear that I am not certain of anything, but I would be doing you a disservice if I did not tell you that I find the shape of this unsettling." The floor did not turn to water beneath my feet. It was more like the moment before that when you feel the ground shift slightly and you are not yet sure whether it will hold. "What do you think they want?" I said. Drummond was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that someone wanted a transaction to appear legitimate and they needed a name with enough credibility in the right circles to make that happen. And I think they may have chosen you very deliberately." He paused. "That is not a conclusion. It is a concern. And I believe you deserve to know it." 3 days after I left Drummond's gallery, I was back in the nursery at 2 a.m, doing what I had done every night for the past 6 weeks, sitting in the glider with Nell, watching the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the particular silence of a house that had recently become quieter than it used to be. Nell had opinions about the 2 o'clock feeding. She always had opinions. I had learned to appreciate them, the insistence, the complete absence of ambiguity. Nell wanted what she wanted, and she communicated it without hesitation or apology. I had been thinking in the long, wordless hours of those nighttime sessions that there was something to be learned from that. My phone buzzed against the arm of the glider. I picked it up without thinking, a reflex from weeks of interrupted sleep, and looked at the screen. An international number, a text message, and a photo. I enlarged the image with 2 fingers. It was a document, a provenance certification, the standard Christie's format, the kind I had filled out dozens of times over the course of my career. The header was in English. The painting was described in formal auction language oil on canvas, early 20th century European school estimate, $1.8 million. And at the bottom in the field marked, appraised and certified by my name, my professional license number, my signature. I stared at it for long enough that Nell finished feeding and made the small sound that meant she was done and ready to be held upright. I shifted her automatically, my eyes still on the screen. Below the photo, a single line of text. "Josephine, is this yours?" The sender's name was Soren. I had not spoken to Soren in nearly 2 years. We had been in the same cohort at the conservation program at the University of Edinburgh, one of those professional friendships that forms quickly in shared circumstances and sustains itself. Afterward, through occasional messages, forwarded articles, the kind of contact that means I still think of you as someone worth knowing. He had gone into auction house work after graduation, Christie's London most recently. I knew this because we were connected through the same professional network that most people in this field used to keep track of one another. I called him back before I had fully decided to. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting. "Josephine." His voice was careful, the voice of someone who had been turning a problem over for several hours and still wasn't sure of the right approach. "I wasn't sure you'd call tonight." "Where did this come from?" I said. "It came in with a consignment 3 days ago. Private seller routed through a dealer. I don't recognize the paperwork is clean on the surface. The chain of custody looks complete." A pause. "It went to pre-sale documentation review this morning, which is how I saw it. I pulled it before it went further. I told my supervisor I needed to verify a technical detail. I have until end of week before someone asks me what I'm doing with it." "Why didn't you file an internal report?" "Because your name is on it," he said simply, "and I know you. And I wanted to give you the chance to tell me this was a misunderstanding before I did anything that couldn't be undone." I closed my eyes briefly. It is not a misunderstanding. I did not sign those documents. I have not been to London. I did not authorize the transport or the consignment. The silence on his end was the silence of someone confirming what they had already suspected. I thought so, Soren said quietly. The signature is good, close enough that it would pass a standard review. But there are things in the documentation that don't align with how I know you work. The certification language is slightly off, formal in the wrong places. Another pause. Someone studied your professional materials carefully, but not carefully enough. Tell me about the painting itself, I said. You have seen it in person. I have. It is in the pre-sale holding room. He paused, and I heard in that pause something I recognized as a trained conservator's hesitation. The particular reluctance of someone who has seen something they cannot immediately explain. The physical work does not fully match the documentation. The description in the provenance papers is consistent with what is in front of me on the surface, but there are details that feel wrong. The dimensions are slightly off from what the paperwork states. The surface texture in certain areas is inconsistent with the supposed period of origin, as if the documentation was written for a different painting, I said. As if the documentation was written for a painting that resembles this one closely enough to pass a quick review, Soren said carefully, but not closely enough for someone who was looking. I said nothing for a moment. I was thinking about the crate that had arrived at my door, the weight of it heavier than the stated dimensions should have accounted for, the brushstroke in the lower left corner, the underdrawing that did not match the composition above it, the painting currently sitting on the easel in my study. What about the canvas treatment, I said. Anything unusual? Another pause longer this time. Yes, Soren said. That is actually what made me stop before I filed anything internally. There is a preparation technique in the ground layer the way the canvas has been primed and prepared before any paint was applied. I cannot identify it. It does not correspond to any workshop practice I can place within the documented period or geographic origin of this work. He was precise in the way that people trained in technical analysis are precise measuring every word before releasing it. It is as if the canvas was prepared by someone working in a different tradition entirely, someone with a very specific and unusual method. Can you document it? I asked. I already have. Full spectrographic analysis, cross-section imaging, fiber sampling. I have everything. A beat. Josephine, I do not know what this painting is, but I know what it is not. And I think you need to see what I have. Send me everything you can through a secure channel, I said. Everything, the imaging data, the spectrographic results, the fiber analysis, all of it. I will. He paused. And I am going to hold this painting. I will tell Christie's I need additional time for technical verification. I can buy us a week, maybe 10 days before the questions become difficult to deflect. Another pause shorter. The estimate on this consignment is $1.8 million. Whoever put this together knew exactly what they were doing. I know, I said. Be careful. I will. After I hung up, I sat in the dark nursery for a long time, listening to Nell breathe. Soren had crossed an ocean's worth of professional risk to send me that text message. I did not know yet what that meant. I only knew that I was no longer entirely alone. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark with the monitor on the nightstand and Nell's breathing coming through the speaker in the slow, even rhythm that should have been calming. And I stared at the ceiling and thought about documents, signatures, a box of files in a back room somewhere 70 miles south of where I was lying. I knew it existed. That was what Drummond had said, not in those words, but that was the shape of it. Someone had known about this painting for a long time. And my mother had left Philadelphia 8 years ago and moved to a small house in Lancaster and stopped returning calls. And I had told myself it was just how some families ended up, distance accumulating until it felt like a decision. At 6 a.m, I called Walter. He answered on the first ring. I can't sleep, I said. I know. His voice was already fully awake, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Walter, does she know about the painting, about any of it? A pause, not a long one. Come, he said. She'll be here. Those 3 words landed differently than I expected. Not I'll ask her or I'll call ahead, just she'll be here. as if Isadora had been waiting for this particular morning for a long time, and Walter had known it. I did not ask him to explain. I went to get Odette. Odette said yes. Before I finished the sentence, she simply appeared at the back door 20 minutes later in her coat, with a bag already packed for Nell, the particular competence of someone who had decided weeks ago to be available for exactly this kind of moment. She took the car seat while I loaded the trunk. She did not ask where we were going until we were already on the Pennsylvania Turnpike heading south. "Lancaster," I said. She nodded as if this was a reasonable thing to do at 7 in the morning with a 6-week-old. Maybe it was. I had stopped being certain about what was reasonable. The drive took just over an hour. Nell slept in the back seat. Odette kept the music low and did not try to fill the quiet, which was the right thing to do. Outside the windows, the suburbs thinned into farmland, the particular flat Pennsylvania landscape of November, gray-brown and dormant. Fields that had finished their work for the year and were waiting. I had not been to Lancaster in 4 years. I had not been to my mother's house since she moved there. The house was small and neat, set back from the road behind a row of old maples that had dropped their leaves. A covered porch. A wooden door painted a dark green that I did not recognize new since the last time or from before I started paying attention. Walter's car was already in the driveway. I sat in my own car for a moment after I turned off the engine. Odette said nothing. She unclipped her seatbelt and reached into the back to check on Nell, giving me the specific gift of having something to do with her hands, so she wasn't watching me. I got out and walked up the porch steps and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. My mother looked exactly like herself. That was the disorienting part. I had constructed some version of her in my memory over years of distance, and the person standing in the doorway was simply Isadora, unchanged in the ways that mattered, the same directness in the eyes, the same quality of attention, the kind that made you feel that whatever you had just walked into, she'd already taken full inventory. She looked at me for a long moment. I looked at her. Neither of us spoke first. There was too much in the way of words, 8 years of it, and we both seemed to understand simultaneously that trying to address it directly would collapse under its own weight. So we didn't. She stepped back from the door, and I walked in, and that was the reconciliation. Not a sentence, not an embrace. Just the threshold crossed. Walter had coffee ready. He set 2 cups on the kitchen table and then moved to the window with his own cup and stayed there, not leaving, but positioning himself as backdrop, giving us the table. I told my mother everything. I told it the way I had learned to tell things in the past several weeks without organizing it for impact, without softening the parts that were difficult to say. Conrad, the business account, the $380,000, the painting, the palimpsest, the encrypted report, Drummond's gallery, Soren's message from London, the provenance documents bearing my name on a consignment I had never authorized. Isadora listened the way Walter listened, without interrupting, without the small sounds people make to signal that they're following. She was completely still. Her expression did not change. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet. I watched her face and waited. She set her coffee cup down, stood up, walked to the back of the house without a word. I looked at Walter. He was looking at his own cup. Odette appeared in the doorway from the sitting room with Nell drowsy in her arms. And the 4 of us existed in that kitchen in a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who are waiting for something that has been a long time coming. Isadora came back carrying a cardboard box. Not large, the kind used for document storage, the kind that sits on a high shelf for years. She set it on the table between us and sat back down. The lid was worn at the corners. Whatever was inside had been organized and reorganized more than once. She looked at me. "I have been waiting 8 years for someone to find that painting, Joe," she said. I knew it existed. I knew what was hidden inside it. That is why they had to silence me to make sure no one would listen if I ever tried to speak. She looked toward the doorway where Odette stood with Nell asleep in her arms. "It ends now," she said. "Whatever it costs, it ends now." Beatrix Holloway's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Walnut Street, 3 blocks from Rittenhouse Square, with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced east and a view of the city that managed to be both impressive and entirely impersonal. The kind of office that was designed to communicate one thing the person behind this desk does not lose. I had found her through Drummond, who had called the evening before and said only that he had someone I should meet and that I should bring everything I had. I had packed the Isadora box, my own documentation files, and Nell's stroller, and I had driven into Center City in the early morning before the parking situation became something I would have to solve. Nell was asleep before I reached the elevator. Beatrix herself was not what I expected, though I am not sure what I expected. She was perhaps 45 with close-cropped hair and the particular quality of attention that some attorneys develop, not warmth exactly, but a kind of directed precision that made you feel that everything you said was being simultaneously filed and assessed. She shook my hand, glanced once at Nell in the stroller, and gestured to the chair across from her desk without ceremony. "Walk me through it," she said. "Everything in order as plainly as you can." I did. She did not take notes while I spoke. She listened with both hands flat on the desk, which I later understood was deliberate. She was building the architecture of it in her head before she committed anything to paper. When I finished, she was quiet for approximately 10 seconds. Then she opened her laptop and began. Drummond arrived 20 minutes into our session, let himself in with the quiet familiarity of someone who had been here before, and set a second file on the desk beside mine without introduction. Beatrix did not look up. "The international documentation," she said, "and the acquisition records from the original seller," Drummond said, "going back 14 months. She pulled the file toward her without comment and kept working. I looked at the two of them, Beatrix moving through documents with the efficiency of someone who reads legal language the way other people read plain text. Drummond seated to my left with his hands folded, and I thought, this is not the first time these two people have been in a room working on a problem together. I did not ask. I filed it and moved on. "The power of attorney." Beatrix said, not looking up from the screen. "You established it during your 3rd trimester." "Yes. For business continuity, in case I was unavailable during the late stages of the pregnancy or the immediate postpartum period." "And Conrad held it. He was my husband. He managed the legal and insurance documentation for the practice. It was standard practice." She looked up briefly. "It was standard practice that he designed to be standard practice." She turned the laptop to face me. "The power of attorney was drafted by his firm. The language in it is broader than what you would typically see in a spousal business arrangement. It granted authority over credit instruments, not just operational paperwork. That language did not happen by accident." I looked at the document on her screen. I had signed it. I remembered signing it at the kitchen table, 8 months pregnant, trusting the man who slid it across to me. "So this was planned," I said. "The credit line drawdown, the transport authorization, the provenance documentation, the sequencing is too precise for this to be opportunistic." Beatrix turned the laptop back. "Someone spent time on this, more than a few months," Drummond said from his chair. "The international trafficking files show a pattern going back further. This is not the first time this particular method has been used." "Tell me about the method," I said. Drummond looked at Beatrix. She nodded once. He explained carefully, in the measured way he had of presenting information, how the network operated. A valuable work would be identified. A credible professional would be selected, someone with a genuine reputation, established credentials, a clean record. The professional's identity would be used to legitimize the movement of the work internationally. By the time the fraud was discovered, the paper trail pointed entirely at the professional, and the people who had constructed the trail were nowhere to be found. "They chose me because of my reputation," I said. "They chose you," Drummond said, "because of your name." The room was quiet for a moment. "The Boston case," Beatrix said and began typing. 7 years ago, a female art consultant based in Cambridge built a strong regional practice, specialized in estate appraisal's clean record. She turned the screen toward me. Her professional credentials were used in connection with the fraudulent export of 3 works over an 18-month period. By the time it surfaced, every document pointed to her. I leaned forward and looked at the screen. The case summary, the timeline, the outcome. "What happened to her?" I asked. She lost her license. Spent 3 years in litigation she had no realistic chance of winning. The paper trail against her was comprehensive, and she had no evidence that anyone had constructed it. Beatrix's voice did not change register as she said this. She stated it the way she stated everything as fact without performance. The case was eventually dropped, but the damage was already done. She never practiced again. The office was very quiet. Outside the east-facing windows, the city continued without comment. I thought about the woman in Boston. I thought about my mother who had spent 8 years in a house in Lancaster with a box of documents on a high shelf, waiting for a morning that looked exactly like this one. Was she able to fight back? I asked. Beatrix looked at me steadily across the desk. She tried. She had no evidence and no one who believed her. She closed the laptop. You have both. I looked down at Nell, sleeping in her stroller, one small fist curled beside her cheek, entirely unaware of the room she was in or what was being decided inside it. I picked up my pen. Tell me what I need to do. He called on a Tuesday evening, a week after the meeting with Beatrix, and said simply, "Come to the gallery when you can. After closing. There is more I should have told you." I arranged for Walter to stay with Nell and drove up to Manhattan in the early evening when the traffic on the New Jersey Turnpike had thinned enough to make the drive bearable. I had been in motion for weeks. Appointments, documents, phone calls. The particular forward momentum of a case being built and the 2 hours in the car were the first sustained quiet I had had since Lancaster. I did not fill them with music or calls. I let them be quiet. The gallery was dark from the street when I arrived. Drummond let me in through the side entrance, locked the door behind us, and led me to the back room without ceremony. The long table. 2 glasses. A bottle of wine I did not recognize, but that Drummond handled with the care of something that had been waiting for a specific occasion. He poured. He sat down. He looked at the glass for a moment. Then he told me about Isadora. He told me she was 23 years old. He was 33 at the time, a decade into what he had hoped would be a career in serious collecting and running out of the resources and credibility that required. He had a painting he had acquired under circumstances he described as impulsive and poorly researched, a work he believed was significant but could not prove, because every established expert in Philadelphia had either turned him away outright or provided assessments so hedged as to be useless. There was a woman, he said, who had just opened an independent practice. She had no prestigious affiliations, no institutional backing. She was young enough that most people in the field were not yet taking her seriously. He turned the wine glass once in his hands. A colleague mentioned her name almost as an afterthought. I called her on a Wednesday. She came to look at the painting on Friday. He described the session the way someone describes a thing they have replayed many times precisely without embellishment. Isadora had arrived alone with a bag of equipment and no assistant, and she had spent 4 hours with the painting without speaking more than was necessary. She had not asked about his background or his intentions. She had looked at the work. At the end of those 4 hours, Drummond said, "She sat down across from me and told me exactly what I had, not what I wanted to hear, what the evidence supported. The painting was not what I had hoped. It was lesser in certain respects than I had believed." He paused. She also told me what it actually was, which turned out to be considerably more interesting than what I had been told when I bought it. She had found something in the underdrawing that no one else had looked for because no one else had looked closely enough. He was quiet for a moment. "That assessment changed everything for me," he said. "Not because of the painting's value, though that mattered, because of what it told me about what serious work looked like. I had been in rooms with established experts for a decade, and I had never seen anyone work the way she worked that afternoon." He looked at me. She was meticulous. She did not inflate, and she did not deflate. She told the truth about the object in front of her, regardless of whether the truth was convenient for anyone in the room. "Including you," I said. "Especially me." He said it without defensiveness. She knew I needed the painting to be worth more than it was. She told me what it was worth anyway. That is rarer than people think. He refilled his glass and set the bottle down carefully. 8 years ago, he said, the accusations appeared. He told me what he knew, not everything he was clear about that, but what had reached him through the channels he had access to. Documentation had surfaced, suggesting that Isadora had misrepresented valuations in connection with a series of estate appraisals. The evidence was detailed and internally consistent. The professional bodies that reviewed it found it credible enough to act on. I looked at the documentation myself, Drummond said. I know what fabricated evidence looks like. I have been in this field long enough to have seen it constructed. And what I saw was careful. Too careful. The kind of careful that takes time and resources and a specific kind of knowledge about how professional records are organized. You tried to help her, I said. I tried. He set down his glass. I made calls. I engaged an attorney. I put forward what I knew of her character and her professional record going back 30 years. None of it was sufficient against what had been built against her. A pause. The people who constructed it understood exactly which pressure points to target. They knew the field. They knew the regulatory structure. They knew how to make something look like a pattern of professional misconduct rather than a single incident. Vance, I said. He looked at me steadily. I have suspected a man named Vance for several years. He operates at the intersection of legitimate dealing and less legitimate movement of works, the kind of figure who is known in certain circles, but never formally connected to anything actionable. He was careful with the phrasing. I have no evidence that rises to the level required to make a formal accusation. What I have is a long accumulation of circumstances that point in a consistent direction. I thought about Beatrix's laptop, the Boston case, the female consultant who had lost everything 7 years ago, the same shape, the same method, different names. Why didn't you tell me any of this the first time you called? I asked. Drummond was quiet for a moment. Because, he said finally, I needed to know whether you were as good as she was. He said it without apology, which I respected. I had her daughter's name and her daughter's credentials. That was not the same thing as knowing whether her daughter could do what needed to be done. He looked at me directly. You found the palimpsest in 48 hours. You called me before I called you. You walked into Beatrix's office and picked up a pen. He paused. You answered my question. The gallery was very quiet around us. The single painting on the far wall, the one he had called a gift the first time I was here, caught the low light from the lamp on the table and held it. I sat with everything he had told me and felt it settle into place, not neatly, not without weight, but with the particular clarity of a thing that has finally been named. Vance's network, the Boston consultant, my mother. The painting that had arrived at my door in a climate-controlled crate addressed specifically to me. The same operation, the same method. 35 years in the making, and I was standing at the end of a line that had begun before I was old enough to understand what any of it meant. I drove home that night along the Schuylkill Expressway with both hands steady on the wheel, and the city lights reflected in the dark water below. Somewhere between his gallery and Chestnut Hill, the grief that had been sitting in my chest for weeks changed shape. It did not disappear. It simply became something I could use. If you've stayed with Josephine this far, drop canvas in the comments. I want to know you're still here. Before we continue, the next part leans into fiction and has been shaped for storytelling purposes. If that's not for you, this is a good place to stop. Otherwise, stay with me. The files from Soren arrived at 11:17 on a Tuesday night. I had been expecting them for 3 days. He had warned me the spectrographic analysis would take time to process and package properly, and that he wanted everything in a single secure transfer rather than piecemeal. When the notification came through on my professional system, I was already at my desk. I had not really left it since Lancaster. I called Isadora before I opened a single file. She picked up on the second ring. It came, she said. Just now. A pause. I will be there in 2 hours. She arrived at 1 in the morning with her equipment case and the particular focused quiet of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. I had coffee ready. Odette had agreed to stay the night in the guest room in case Nell needed attention. Walter had called earlier that evening and said simply, "Call me when you know something." which was the most Walter thing he had ever said. I set up the second monitor on the desk. Isadora pulled her chair alongside mine. We opened the files together. Soren had been thorough in the way that only someone who understands the stakes can be thorough. The transfer contained 4 categories of data: full spectrographic analysis of the paint layer's cross-section imaging from multiple points across the canvas surface, fiber sampling results from the ground layer, and a comparative provenance analysis he had compiled from Christie's internal records and 3 external databases. Each file was labeled, dated, and annotated with his own observations, precise, measured. The notes of someone who had looked at the work with full professional attention and was reporting exactly what he had found. I opened the spectrographic analysis first. Isadora leaned forward. The data showed what Soren had described on the phone, a ground layer preparation that did not correspond to any standard workshop practice within the documented period of origin. But seeing it rendered in the spectrographic imaging was different from hearing it described. The layering sequence was specific, unusual, the kind of technique that belonged to a particular tradition, a particular training, a particular pair of hands. I looked at Isadora. She was very still. "Mom," I said quietly. She did not answer. She reached past me and opened the cross-section imaging files, moving through them with the speed of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Her eyes went from one image to the next without pausing. Then she stopped. She put her finger on the screen, not touching it, just pointing the way you point at something when you want someone else to see what you are seeing. "Here," she said. "The way the ground has been laid in this sequence, the specific order of the layers, the pigment ratios in the primer coat. This is not a workshop technique. This is not something you learn from a manual." She paused. "This is something you learn from a person. You recognize it," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "My mother had a method," she said finally. "She developed it over decades. It was specific to her the way a signature is specific to a person. She taught it to me when I was young, before I fully understood what I was learning. I have never seen it in anyone else's work." She looked at the imaging data on the screen. "I am seeing it now." The study was very quiet around us. Outside, Chestnut Hill was asleep. The only sound was the soft feed of data loading on the second monitor. At that moment, my laptop chimed Soren, connecting via video from London. It was early morning there. He had not slept. "You have the files," he said. It was not a question. "We have the files," I said. "Isadora is here." He looked at her for a moment across the screen with the particular expression of someone meeting a person they have only known through their work. "The ground layer technique," he said. "You recognize it." "I do," Isadora said. "I spent 2 days going through every record I could access," Soren said. "Auction catalogs, museum conservation reports, private collection documentation going back to the 1940s. I was looking for the same preparation technique appearing in any documented work." He paused. "I found it in 3 places. All 3 works trace back to a single collection, a family in Vienna. The collection was dispersed in 1943. The room was very still. Isadora set down the coffee cup she'd been holding. "My mother described a painting to me," she said quietly. "When I was 6 years old, she described it in detail, the colors, the composition, the quality of light in it. She said it had belonged to her family before the war, that it had been taken and never recovered." She looked at Soren on the screen. She described the way the colors looked like a window into a world that no longer existed. Soren looked at her for a long moment. The work currently in Christie's pre-sale holding, he said carefully, was entered into consignment using documentation built around a painting that matches that description exactly. Whoever constructed the paperwork had access to detailed provenance records, the kind of records that would only exist in specialized archives. He paused. "I believe the painting on that documentation, the painting your credentials were used to certify, Josephine, is the work your grandmother described. And I believe it has been hidden inside a second canvas for a very long time." A long silence settled over the room. I turned slowly in my chair and looked at the canvas sitting on the easel across the study, the woman at the window. The surface I had examined 100 times, the one that had felt wrong from the very first night, not wrong in any way I could document, just wrong in the way that my hands had known before my brain did. I thought about the weight of the crate when it arrived, heavier than the stated dimensions should have accounted for. A brushstroke in the lower left corner made by a different hand. "Soren," I said quietly. "The painting currently at Christie's, the one you are holding. Is it the same work I received from Drummond?" A pause, careful, measured. "The dimensions match the documentation Drummond provided," Soren said. "The surface description matches your preliminary report, and the ground layer technique," he stopped. "Yes, I believe it is." I looked at the canvas on the easel. What was sitting in front of me was not the painting Drummond had sent. It was a copy close enough to pass a quick inspection, close enough that I had stood in front of it 3 days ago and only felt the difference rather than seen it. Conrad had taken the real painting. He had left this in its place and walked out of my house believing he had taken everything of value. He had not known about the layer beneath. Neither of us spoke for a very long time after that. I had slept 3 hours when the doorbell rang. Nell had been up twice in the night, once at 2, once at 4:30, and I had fed her both times in the dark study. Sitting in the chair by the window with the files still open on my laptop screen, unable to separate the work from the waking the way I used to be able to do. By the time gray morning light came through the curtains, I had not so much fallen asleep as stopped being conscious for a while. The doorbell rang at 8:15. I came downstairs with Nell in my arms and found Beatrix already in my front hallway. She had a key I had given her 1-2 weeks prior for exactly this kind of situation, and she had let herself in and was standing at the foot of the stairs with her briefcase and the expression of someone who had been awake considerably longer than I had. Behind her, through the glass panel beside the front door, I could see 2 figures on the porch. "They are here," Beatrix said simply. I looked at her. "You called them. The morning after our first meeting," she said. "I should have told you, but I needed to move before the London auction closed." She held my gaze steadily. "I did not ask for permission because there was no time to ask for permission. I hope you understand that." I did. I had hired her precisely because she was the kind of person who moved without waiting to be told. Remington was not what I had constructed in my mind from the name and the title. He was perhaps 40 with the kind of face that gave away very little. Not cold, not warm, simply professional in the specific way of someone who had learned that legibility was a liability in his line of work. He introduced himself at the door, Special Agent Remington FBI Art Crime Team, working in coordination with ICE and Interpol on an active international investigation. His colleague, a younger woman who remained near the door with a tablet and said nothing throughout, completed the introduction with a brief nod. "Come in," I said. I led them to the dining room table, which had become, over the preceding weeks, the operational center of everything files stacked in organized sections. Beatrix's folders interspersed with my own documentation, Isadora's photographs and handwritten notes from the box she had carried from Lancaster spread across the far end. Remington took it in without comment. He set his own case on the table and sat down. Beatrix sat across from him. I sat at the head of the table with Nell in my lap and said nothing. Beatrix presented the file. She had organized it in the way she organized everything, with the precision of someone who understands that the sequence in which information is delivered determines how it lands. She walked Remington through the documentation chronologically: the power of attorney, the credit line, authorization, the false export paperwork, the Christie's consignment. The provenance irregularities Soren had identified from London, the connection to the Boston case from 7 years ago. Remington listened without interrupting. He did not take notes while she spoke. He had the same quality of attention I had noticed in Beatrix, the kind that processes and files in real time. When she finished, he opened his own case and produced a file of his own. "The network you have identified," he said, "has been under active federal investigation for 14 months. We have documented connections to 43 confirmed cases across 9 countries spanning 15 years. He paused. "The methodology is consistent across all cases. A credible professional is selected. Their identity is used to legitimize the movement of works through international channels. The paper trail is constructed to redirect liability entirely onto the professional. He looked at me briefly. You fit the profile they have used before. Precisely. I looked at the table. There is something else, Remington said. He opened a second section of his file and slid a single page across the table toward me. It was a case summary, a name at the top of the page that I recognized immediately. Isadora. Below her name, 2 lines. Category wrongfully accused. Case status reopened as of this morning. I read those 2 lines 3 times. I did not say anything. Remington watched me read it and did not fill the silence, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. Beatrix to my left was equally still. Nell had fallen asleep against my arm at some point in the preceding minutes, her weight warm and complete, entirely undisturbed by the particular quality of quiet that had settled over the room. There was nothing to say that the document had not already said. 8 years confirmed in 2 lines on a federal case summary. I had known it since Lancaster. I had known it longer than that in the way you know things you are not ready to examine directly. Seeing it in official language was different. I set the page down carefully. Conrad, I said. It was the first word I had spoken since sitting down. Does not know we have been watching, Remington said. He believes the transaction is complete. He believes you have no recourse, that the paper trail is too comprehensive, the debt too large, the professional damage already done. A pause. He has been in contact with Vance's network as recently as 4 days ago. He is as far as he is aware in a position of complete security. I thought about the call, the measured voice, the home thing, the careful logistics of a man who had organized his exit the way he organized a legal brief sequence structure. No loose ends. He thought there were no loose ends. He did not know about the files on my dining room table. He did not know about the box from Lancaster or the spectrographic data from London, or the woman sitting across from me who had spent 14 months building toward exactly this moment. He did not know that the painting he believed he had sold was carrying something inside it that no one in his network had ever looked for. How long? I asked. Remington looked at me with the particular patience of someone who has spent 20 years waiting for the right moment to close a case. Not long, he said. He thinks he won. That is the most dangerous thing a guilty man can think. 2 weeks of silence is a long time when you are waiting for a storm. It had been 14 days since Agent Remington walked out of my front door, 14 days of living in a house that felt like a sensory deprivation chamber. I had followed his instructions to the letter. I didn't call. I didn't check the professional forums. I didn't post a single word on any social network. I simply existed in the quiet feeding Nell, watching the gray Philadelphia light move across the floor and waiting. The knock came at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. It wasn't the frantic, heavy-handed knock of a man in trouble. It was familiar 3 sharp, rhythmic raps, followed by a pause. The knock of a man who owned the door he was standing behind. I looked through the peephole. Conrad was standing on the porch, a bouquet of white lilies in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. He looked impeccable. A charcoal overcoat, a silk scarf, his hair cut with the surgical precision of a man who had recently upgraded his lifestyle. I opened the door. "Joe," he said, stepping inside before I could invite him. He didn't wait for a greeting. He walked past me into the foyer, the scent of expensive cologne and cold air trailing behind him. "You look tired, but the house looks good, clean." He moved into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't looking for memories. He was assessing an asset. He checked the crown molding the granite countertops the way the light hit the breakfast nook. He moved with a restless, predatory energy, a sharp contrast to the way I sat down at the kitchen table and remained perfectly still. He set the flowers on the counter next to a stack of mail. Then, with a fluid, practiced motion, he reached into his briefcase and dropped a thick, legal-sized envelope beside the lilies. "I thought it was time we settled this," he said. He didn't sit down. He paced the length of the kitchen, his hands in his pockets. "I've opened the new office on Rittenhouse Square. The firm is already attracting the kind of high-net-worth estate clients Philadelphia hasn't seen in a decade. It's a new version of the practice Joe, a new version of me. I didn't look at the envelope, I looked at him. And Nell. Conrad paused near the bouncer where Nell was sitting. She was awake, her dark, serious eyes tracking his movement with an intensity that felt older than 6 weeks. He didn't lean down. He didn't touch her. He looked at her the way a man looks at a complicated tax line, something that needed to be managed but didn't require his affection. "The terms are in there," he said, gesturing to the envelope. "I've been generous considering the circumstances." I picked up the document. My hands were steady. I turned to the summary of terms and read them in the flat, clinical light of the kitchen. The $380,000 credit line, the debt he had manufactured using my signature, was to be assumed entirely by me. The business, the equipment, and the house in Chestnut Hill would remain mine, along with the crushing liability he had attached to them. And at the bottom, the child support $200 per month. I read the number twice. $200. In Philadelphia, that barely covered a week of high-quality formula and a box of diapers. $200, I said quietly. "It's a placeholder," Conrad said, stopping by the window to check his watch. "Until you get your practice back on its feet. Given the current volatility of your reputation, I assumed you'd appreciate the lower overhead." He laughed, then a short, confident sound that lacked any trace of the man I had married 4 years ago. He was high on his own success, blinded by the brilliance of the frame he had built around me. He believed I was trapped, a disgraced appraiser with a newborn and a mountain of debt, grateful for whatever crumbs he brushed off his silk sleeves. I set the document down. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The grief had been burned out of me weeks ago, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of the evidence sitting in an FBI file on Walnut Street. "I won't be signing this, Conrad," I said. He stopped pacing. He turned to look at me, a patronizing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Josephine, be realistic. You have no leverage. The transport documents in London, the signature on the credit line. It's all there. If this goes to a contested hearing, you'll lose everything. The house, the license, maybe even custody if I push the financial instability angle." I stood up slowly. I was still sitting in my old leggings and a faded sweatshirt, but the physical power in the room had shifted. I was the one holding the truth. He was the one holding a bouquet of dying lilies. "I'll see you in court, Conrad," I said. The smile faltered just for a fraction of a second before the arrogance flooded back in. He walked over, picked up the envelope, and tucked it firmly under my arm. "Sign it by Friday, Joe," he said, his voice dropping to a low, warning tone. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, for your sake and hers." He didn't look at Nell one last time. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. I heard the front door open, the rustle of the lilies he'd left on the counter, and then the heavy thud of the door closing behind him. I stood there for a long time, the weight of the envelope against my ribs. I listened to his footsteps fade down the front walk. The engine of his new car started up a smooth, expensive purr that disappeared into the afternoon traffic. The house was quiet again. Nell was watching me from her bouncer. She hadn't made a sound the entire time he was in the room. She watched me with those dark, serious eyes, the same eyes she had been watching me with since the day she was born, as though she already understood the architecture of the world and was simply waiting for me to catch up. "I know," I told her quietly. I walked over and unclipped her from the bouncer, pulling her warm, solid weight against my chest. "I know. We weren't just waiting anymore. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for Friday." Remington had told me the night before to park on Walnut Street by 7:45 and to stay in the car. Those were his exact words. "Stay in the car, Miss Josephine. Whatever you see, stay in the car." I had agreed without asking why, because I understood by then that the people who had spent 15 years building this case knew something about timing that I did not. I left Nell with Odette at 6 a.m. Odette had arrived with a canvas bag full of formula and a thermos of coffee she pressed into my hands without a word. She had been doing that for weeks now, arriving with things I needed before I knew I needed them. I drank half the thermos on the drive into the city and felt it do nothing at all. The building Conrad worked in stood on the south side of Rittenhouse Square, a narrow-fronted structure of pale limestone that had once been a private banking house. The partners had kept the original brass fittings on the doors. I had been inside twice in the years we were married. I had thought it was beautiful. I sat in the car across the street and looked at those doors and thought about nothing in particular. 752. A woman in a gray coat walked a small dog along the square's iron fence. Two cyclists crossed at the far end. The city was still waking up, moving at the slow, considered pace of a Tuesday in late autumn, and nothing about the street suggested that anything was about to happen. That was the point, I supposed. Remington had explained that the people he worked with were trained specifically to look like nothing was about to happen. At 8:02, my phone buzzed. A single encrypted message from Remington's number. 2 words, "We're ready." I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and looked at the building doors. At 8:15, 3 people in dark coats entered through the revolving door. They were not in uniform. They walked at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, a pace that announced nothing and meant everything. I watched the door complete its revolution and go still. Then I waited. The waiting was the part no one had prepared me for. In the weeks since Remington first appeared on my doorstep with his colleague and his careful, unhurried manner, I had thought about the arrest many times. I had imagined it the way you imagine things you have no direct experience of in broad shapes and dramatic gestures, the way films present consequences. What I had not imagined was 23 minutes of watching a revolving door while a woman walked her small dog around Rittenhouse Square a second time and a food service truck made a slow turn at the corner. I thought about Conrad handing me his tablet 7 months ago, pointing to the signature line while Nell's formula heated on the stove. I thought about the word routine. I thought about the box Isadora had carried from Lancaster and set on my kitchen table without explanation, and about Drummond pouring wine in his empty gallery and saying I needed to know if you were as good as your mother. I thought about Soren's voice over the phone from London, steady and careful, saying, I don't believe you could have made an error of this magnitude. At 8:38, the revolving door turned again. Conrad came out first. He was wearing the charcoal coat I had seen him leave in 100 times, the one with the narrow lapels he had bought on a business trip to Chicago 3 years ago. His hands were behind his back. The steel of the handcuffs caught the morning light for only a moment before the angle shifted and it was gone. He did not look up. He walked the 12 steps to the waiting vehicle with his head slightly down, and I watched him get in, and I watched the door close. And I sat with my hands in my lap and felt something I had no name for. Not satisfaction, not grief, not the particular relief I had expected. Something quieter than all of those. Something that had been waiting a long time to be set down. The vehicle pulled away from the curb. I watched it until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then I sat in the car on Walnut Street for a while longer and listened to the city make its ordinary sounds. Remington called me 40 minutes later. I was already on the Schuylkill Expressway, both hands on the wheel, the river moving alongside me in the gray morning light. It's done, he said. He invoked attorney-client privilege immediately, which tells you something about how prepared he was for a different version of this conversation. A brief pause. We got what we needed from the laptop, the encryption on Vance's server. Conrad had the key sequence stored locally. He thought that was a security measure. Another pause. It was not. And Vance, I asked, simultaneous, different city, same outcome. He said it with the particular evenness of someone reporting a weather condition. We'll need you in the office Thursday morning for a formal statement. Beatrix should be present. She will be, I said, Miss Josephine. He said it the way he always did, not as a Southern courtesy, but as a signal that what followed was something he had chosen carefully. You did well. All of it. I did not know what to say to that. I said, thank you, because it was true, and because I had learned in the past weeks that the simple true thing was usually enough. I drove home to Nell. I pulled into the driveway in Chestnut Hill and sat for a moment before I went inside, looking at the front door of the house. The the same door I had opened the night Drummond first called. Standing in the hallway with a 3-week-old baby and no idea what any of it meant. I went inside. Odette was in the kitchen. Nell was awake and making the small, insistent sounds that meant she was ready to be held. I picked her up. She settled against my shoulder with the absolute trust that only very young children have, the trust that the person holding them will simply continue to hold them. That was enough. I realized, exactly enough. Thursday arrived the way days do when you are not ready for them, without apology and without warning. Odette had been at the house since 8 in the morning, sitting in the living room with Nell and a hardcover book about birds that Nell used more as a percussion instrument than as reading material. I put on the only blazer I had brought back from Lancaster, a dark navy one that Isadora had pressed into my bag without explanation, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than necessary. Beatrix picked me up at 8:45. She drove a white car with black leather seats, and when I settled into the passenger side, she looked me over once and said, "Good. You look like you slept." That was the only compliment Beatrix had ever paid me, and I understood that for her, looking like you slept was a serious professional skill. The FBI field office was on Arch Street, a federal building that looked exactly like what it was, with ordinary signage and a security checkpoint that was not ordinary at all. Remington met us in the lobby, shook Beatrix's hand first and then mine, and led us into a room with a window overlooking a parking structure. There were 2 recording devices on the table. There was a cup of coffee waiting for me that no one had asked me whether I wanted the kind of coffee that someone places on a table, because they already know you will need it. "Today is straightforward," Remington said, settling into the chair across from us. "We need you to walk us through everything in sequence, starting from Drummond's first call through yesterday morning." He looked at me steadily. "Don't omit anything because you think it doesn't matter. In cases like this, the detail people leave out is usually the one that matters most." I looked at Beatrix. She gave one small nod. I began. I had told the story many times by then, to Beatrix, to Remington on my doorstep, to Walter sitting quietly in the Lancaster kitchen, but this was the first time I told it formally, with the recording devices running and a stenographer in the corner of the room that I hadn't noticed until a few minutes in. There is something different about speaking to a recording device. You cannot read its reaction. You cannot adjust your pacing based on how a face shifts. You simply speak, and the words become a record, and the record becomes evidence, and the evidence becomes something a federal judge will read in a room you will not be present in. I started from the night Drummond called 11 in the evening, Nell 3 weeks old, the phone ringing on the bedside table. I described the crate arriving the following morning, the way it felt heavier than expected when Walter and I carried it up the stairs. I described the examination raking light ultraviolet infrared, the high magnification loop and the brushstroke in the lower left corner that I saw at 10 o'clock at night, while Conrad had been asleep for hours. I described the encrypted report I sent to Drummond. I described Conrad appearing in the doorway, asking what I was doing, me saying just checking something, and him kissing my forehead and telling me not to work too late. I described the formless unease I felt after he left that I could not name at the time. Remington did not interrupt. The stenographer did not look up. Beatrix sat with her hands flat on the table and did not change expression. I described the postpartum appointment, Conrad dressed and ready at 7 in the morning, offering to drive, carrying the diaper bag over his shoulder as if that were the most natural thing in the world. I described coming home and standing in front of the painting and feeling that something had shifted in a way I could not identify. I did not know then that Conrad had switched the real painting while we were out. I only knew that the canvas on the easel no longer felt like the canvas I had examined 2 days before. I thought at the time that it was exhaustion that I was looking at the same object with eyes that had changed because of what I had found beneath it. I was wrong about that, but I recorded it as I had experienced it, not as I understand it now. I described the morning Conrad disappeared, the empty wardrobe, the watch no longer on the dresser surface, the call from a New York number at 9:30 in the morning, and the voice of someone announcing a routine administrative matter calm in the particular way that makes the person receiving the call question their own perception. better opportunities. Park Avenue. I need somewhere I can actually function. And then, almost as an afterthought about Nell, she cries constantly, Josephine. I cannot work. I cannot think. Remington looked up for the first time when I said that. Not out of surprise, I did not think anything in his files surprised him anymore, but with the focused attention of someone who wants to make certain a specific detail is captured correctly. I continued. I described the $847 in the personal account, the $380,000 drawn down entirely from the business credit line under the category of equipment purchase. My signature on the authorization, Conrad handing me his tablet while I was heating Nell's formula, pointing to the signature line and saying, just a routine insurance update, Joe. I had not read a single word. I had trusted him completely. I described Walter coming, Odette arriving with formula and diapers, calling Drummond and telling him about the palimpsest that the painting he had sent contained a hidden layer beneath the surface that I had not had the chance to tell Conrad about before the EEO switch was made. The meeting at the gallery after closing when Drummond first mentioned Isadora's name. I described Soren, a former classmate now at Christie's London, who had sent me a photograph of provenance documents bearing my name at 2 o'clock in the morning. The long phone call in the dark nursery while Nell slept, and Soren explained carefully and without drama that he did not believe I could have made an error of this magnitude. The agreement to stay quiet while he continued investigating internally from London. I described Lancaster, the dark green door and the way Isadora and I stood looking at each other on the threshold, and neither of us spoke first. The box of documents she carried out from the back room, photographs, handwritten notes, legal filings from 8 years ago. The first time I heard the full account of what had happened to my mother, told by her at the kitchen table while Walter made coffee and said nothing at all. I described Beatrix and the Boston file, Remington appearing at my front door with the page that read, Isadora category wrongfully accused. Case status reopened, as of this morning. The dining room becoming an operational center with file boxes and laptops and light running until past midnight. And I described last Tuesday. Parking on Walnut Street at 7:45. 3 people in dark coats entering through the revolving door at 8:15. 23 minutes of waiting while the city continued at its ordinary pace, as though nothing was happening. The steel of the handcuffs catching the morning light for 1 second before the angle changed and it was gone. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The stenographer set down her pen. One of the recording devices made a small click as it paused and restarted itself. Remington looked at me. Is there anything you'd like to add? He asked. Anything you think we may have missed? I thought about that. Actually thought about it. The painting on the easel in my workroom, I said. The copy Conrad left behind, it's still there. I haven't touched it. Remington nodded slowly. We'll need to take it in. A pause. Physical evidence. I know, I said. You can take it whenever you need to. Beatrix glanced at me from the side with something that I thought, if she were someone else, might be called pride. On Beatrix, it looked like deliberate approval, more precise but no less genuine. We left the building at 12:15. Outside on Arch Street, the air was cold and flat, the kind of February air in Philadelphia that carries no particular promise and makes none. Beatrix unlocked the car. I stood on the pavement for a moment and looked up at the sky, a uniform white nothing remarkable about it. How long? I asked. Beatrix stood on the other side of the car, her hand on the door handle. Preliminary hearing could be 6 weeks, she said. The actual trial, 8 months. Maybe 12. She paused. Depends on how hard they want to fight. And if they want to fight, then we give them something to fight against, she said in the tone of someone stating the most obvious fact in the world. You gave me enough for that in the last 3 hours. I got in the car. Beatrix drove. The city moved past the windows the way cities do, indifferent, continuous, unconcerned, with anyone sitting inside a vehicle passing through it. When we crossed the Schuylkill, I looked down at the river below and thought about the canvas on the easel at home, the copy Conrad had left behind, still standing in the dark workroom waiting, and somewhere across the Atlantic, the real painting, 2 layers. The lower one, concealing something that even the people who had stolen it did not know they were carrying, was sitting in a Christie's London storage vault, tagged as evidence in a federal case that 15 years had built toward. I thought about Soren in London with his spectrographic data and cross-section imaging still waiting. I thought about Isadora in Lancaster with her box of 8 years' worth of documents and 8 years' worth of patience. I thought about Nell at home with Odette knocking the hardcover bird book against the floor. Some things were being held still, and some things were about to be given back. 8 months is a long time when you are measuring it in Nell. At the time of Conrad's arrest, she had been 14 weeks old, small enough that she still curled her knees toward her chest when she slept, still startled at sounds she would later learn to ignore. By the time the trial concluded on a Thursday morning in late October, she was 14 months old and had recently decided that walking was more interesting than crawling, which meant that every room in the house on Chestnut Hill had become a problem she was actively trying to solve. I followed her progress across the living room floor the morning the verdict came, in one hand trailing along the sofa edge, 2 steps without support, a third. Then a careful sit-down onto the rug as if she had planned it that way. I was on the phone with Beatrix when it happened. I watched Nell look up at me with an expression of complete self-satisfaction, and I thought not for the first time in those 8 months that she had managed to do a great deal of growing up while I was otherwise occupied. The jury came back at 9:52, Beatrix said. She was not a person who led with emotion, which meant the information arrived cleanly in the order it had occurred. Conrad guilty on all 14 counts. Wire fraud, identity fraud, conspiracy to commit art trafficking, unauthorized use of financial power of attorney. The judge will sentence in 6 weeks. A pause. Vance guilty on 22 counts. The trafficking charges carry a mandatory minimum. He will not be practicing in any capacity for a very long time. I sat down on the sofa. Nell pulled herself upright again using my knee and stood there for a moment steady, looking at me with the particular concentration of someone who has just learned something important about balance. "And my mother's case," I asked. "Formally vacated this morning," Beatrix said. "Expunged from the record." The court's language was unambiguous. The original accusation was fabricated using falsified provenance documentation, and the fabrication was traced directly to Vance's network. Another pause, the kind Beatrix used when she was choosing words with particular care. "She will receive a written apology from the court. It is not common. The judge insisted on it." I did not say anything for a moment. "Josephine," Beatrix said. "I heard you," I said. "I'm here." Walter drove down from Lancaster that afternoon. He arrived at 4 o'clock with a paper bag from the Italian bakery on Prince Street that Isadora had always refused to acknowledge she liked, and he set it on the kitchen table without fanfare and put the kettle on. Odette came over from next door 20 minutes later with a bottle of wine she had apparently been saving for an occasion she did not specify, and the 4 of us, Walter, Odette, Nell in her high chair methodically dismantling a bread roll, and I sat around the table in the late October light and did not talk about the verdict for a long time. We talked about the oak tree in the backyard that Walter thought needed trimming before winter. We talked about the bread roll, which Nell had reduced to a small pile of fragments with impressive efficiency. We talked about Odette's sister, who had recently moved to Asheville and was apparently very enthusiastic about it. It was Walter who finally said it quietly while Odette was refilling her glass, and Nell had begun to lose interest in the bread and gain interest in the tray of her high chair. "Your mother sends her love," he said. "She wanted to be here. She thought it might be too much for her." I understood what he meant. 8 years is a long time to carry something, and the moment it is finally set down is not always the moment you expect to feel relief. Sometimes relief takes longer to arrive than the verdict does. Sometimes it needs a few days of quiet before it can find you. "Tell her I'll call tonight," I said. Walter nodded. He looked at Nell for a moment, at her small hands working at the high chair tray with total focus, and something moved across his face that I did not have a word for but recognized as the particular expression of someone who is measuring distance between the past and the present and finding the gap smaller than they expected. She would have liked to see this, he said. He was not talking about the verdict. Remington called at 6 o'clock. He was brief, which I had come to understand was his form of consideration, he knew, when a long explanation was what the moment needed and when it was not. Conrad's attorneys will appeal the sentencing, he said. That is standard, and it will not change the outcome. I want you to hear that from me directly before you read anything else. A pause. The painting, the genuine work, will be formally released from evidence and returned to Drummond within the next 45 days. He's already been notified. And Soren? I asked. He's flying in from London next week, Remington said. He's been in contact with Drummond directly. I understand there are arrangements being made. His voice carried the particular neutrality of someone who knows more than they are saying and has decided the rest is not theirs to tell. I thanked him. He said it was not necessary. We ended the call. I put Nell to bed at 7:30. She went down without protest, which happened rarely enough that I stood in the doorway of the nursery for a moment afterward, listening to the silence, half expecting her to change her mind. She did not. I went to the workroom. I had not been in it since the FBI team had come to collect the copy. They had been methodical and careful. And when they left, the easel stood empty in the center of the room, an absence that was more visible than the painting had been. I had not moved the easel. I had not adjusted anything. The room had remained exactly as they had left it, and I had closed the door and not opened it since. I opened it now. The easel was still there, empty in the November light that came through the window at an angle that made the room look different from how I remembered it, quieter somehow, as though it had been waiting for the right kind of quiet rather than simply the absence of sound. I stood in the doorway for a long time. 8 months ago, I had stood in this room and looked at a painting that I did not yet know was a copy and felt something shift in a way I could not name. I had told myself it was exhaustion. I had been wrong, and I had also been right. It was exhaustion, and it was also something else entirely. Something that had taken 8 months and a federal trial and a jury of 12 people in a courtroom I had only visited twice to fully resolve. The real painting was coming back. Not to this room, it would go to Drummond and then to wherever it was meant to go after that, which was a question I thought I understood the shape of, but did not yet know the full answer to. But it was coming back into the light, which was what mattered. What had been hidden for 80 years was about to be seen. I turned off the light in the workroom and pulled the door closed behind me. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Soren was on a plane. In Lancaster, Isadora was sitting in a kitchen I knew as well as my own, and a phone was about to ring, and she would pick it up. I went to call my mother. Soren arrived on a Wednesday. I knew his flight was landing at Philadelphia International at 2:15 in the afternoon because he had sent me the details in a brief, characteristically precise message the night before flight number terminal estimated customs clearance time, and a single line at the end that said, "I have been looking forward to this for a long time." I read it 3 times before I understood that he was not talking about the flight. Drummond had arranged everything. That was, I had come to understand what Drummond did. He arranged things with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent decades ensuring that important moments had the conditions they required. He had reserved the main gallery space after closing, had the climate controls adjusted to the correct temperature and humidity for the work, and had arranged for an independent conservation specialist from the Philadelphia Museum of Art to be present as a formal witness. He had called me the week before to go through the details, and at the end of the call, he had said simply, "Bring your mother." So I did. Isadora drove up from Lancaster on Wednesday morning. She arrived at the house on Chestnut Hill at 11, and when I opened the door, she was standing on the front step with a small overnight bag and the expression of someone who has been preparing for something for a very long time and is now not entirely sure what to do with their hands. I took the bag from her. We stood in the hallway for a moment, not quite looking at each other in the particular way of people who have said the important things already and are now simply occupying the same space, which is its own kind of conversation. Nell solved the problem as she often did by appearing from the direction of the kitchen at considerable speed and attaching herself to Isadora's leg with both arms. Isadora looked down at her, and the expression on her face shifted into something I did not have a clinical word for but recognized completely. "Hello, little one," she said quietly. Nell looked up at her with the absolute confidence of a 14-month-old who has not yet learned that some moments are supposed to feel significant. We arrived at Drummond Fine Arts at 6:15. The gallery was dark from the street, the main lights off, only the recessed track lighting visible through the front windows, casting the interior in the kind of warm, directional illumination that conservation work requires. Soren was already inside. I saw him through the glass before Drummond opened the door, taller than I had imagined from our phone calls, standing with his hands in his coat pockets near the center of the room, looking at the covered canvas on the main examination table with the expression of someone keeping themselves deliberately still. Drummond opened the door. He shook my hand, then Isadora's holding hers for a moment longer. "I am very glad you are here," he said to her. It was not a formal pleasantry. He meant it precisely. Soren crossed the room. He shook my hand and said, "It's good to finally do this in person." And I said yes, because it was true, and I could not think of anything more adequate. He turned to Isadora and introduced himself, and she looked at him for a moment, with the careful attention she brought to everything. "You kept the painting safe," she said. "In London, when you didn't have to." Soren considered that. "I wasn't certain of anything at that point," he said honestly, "but I was certain it wasn't right. That seemed like enough reason." Isadora nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected about him. The conservation specialist, a woman named Doctor Hartley from the museum, who had the precise, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to working with irreplaceable things, had set up her equipment along the left wall: fiber optic lighting, a secondary infrared scanner, a camera on a mounted arm positioned above the table. She introduced herself briefly and explained that she would document the process and provide an independent assessment for the formal restitution record. She did not ask unnecessary questions. We gathered around the table. The painting had been transported from Christie's London under federal escort and released to Drummond 3 days earlier. It arrived in a sealed, climate-controlled crate. The same kind of crate it had been shipped in the first time, the same kind that had felt heavier than expected when Walter and I had carried it up the stairs of the house on Chestnut Hill 14 months ago. Drummond had not opened it until this evening. He had waited. He cut the sealing tape now with a conservation knife, working slowly and without drama. The latches released in sequence. He lifted the lid and set it aside. The painting inside was wrapped in archival tissue and secured with conservation-grade fasteners. Drummond lifted it out, set it on the table, and stood back. "Doctor." Hartley adjusted the fiber optic lamp. Soren moved slightly to the left to give everyone a clear sightline. Drummond looked at me. "Miss Josephine," he said quietly. I understood what he was asking. I stepped forward and began removing the archival tissue, working from the edges inward, the way I had been trained, slow, deliberate, no pressure on the surface. Attention on the fasteners before anything else. The tissue came away in sections. The canvas emerged gradually, the way things emerge when you are being careful, not all at once, but in pieces that assemble themselves into a whole. The symbolist surface layer was still intact. The painting, as Conrad and Vance had known it, as the Christie's catalog had described it, as it had appeared in the provenance documents bearing my name. It was technically a convincing work, a competent forgery built to carry the weight of legitimate sale. Under any normal examination, it would have held. But I was not looking at the surface. I was looking at what I now knew was beneath it, what Isadora's spectrographic data and Soren's cross-section analysis had confirmed. What Isadora's grandmother had described to a 6-year-old girl as a window into a world that no longer existed. Dr. Hartley's equipment confirmed the palimpsest in under 4 minutes. The infrared reading showed the underdrawing of the concealed work, clearly a composition entirely different from the surface image, executed in a ground layer technique that Isadora recognized before Dr. Hartley finished her notation. Isadora had not moved since we began. She stood at the edge of the table with her arms at her sides, and when the infrared image resolved on Doctor, Hartley's screen. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. "That is the signature technique," she said finally. Her voice was steady. "My mother showed me. She said it was the only painter she ever knew who prepared a ground that way." She paused. "She said you could recognize it the way you recognize a person's handwriting, even after a long time, even if you had only seen it once." No one spoke. Soren looked at the screen, then at Isadora, then at me. His expression was the particular expression of someone who has spent months working toward a moment and is now inside it and finding it both exactly what they expected and entirely different. "The formal disassembly will need to take place under controlled conditions at the museum," Dr. Hartley said carefully, "with the full restitution panel present. I can have a recommendation ready within the week." "Yes," Drummond said, "whatever the process requires." Dr. Hartley made a note. The camera on the mounted arm continued its documentation. The fiber optic light held the canvas in its warm, precise beam, and the painting, both layers of it. The false surface and the real thing beneath lay on the table in the center of the room and waited as it had been waiting for 80 years for someone to finally look at it properly. We left the gallery at 9:45. The November air outside was cold and still, and the street was quiet the way Center City gets quiet. Late on a weeknight, not empty but unhurried, the city operating at a lower register. Drummond walked us to the door. He shook Soren's hand and said something to him quietly that I did not hear. He turned to Isadora last. "Your mother would have been pleased," he said. Isadora looked at him for a moment. "She would have been relieved," she said. "That is not quite the same thing, but it is enough."
Drummond nodded. He understood the distinction. We walked out into the November night, Isadora beside me, Soren, a half step behind the city, moving quietly around us. I thought about the painting on the table inside, about the 80 years it had spent concealed beneath a false surface, carrying something that no one who had handled it in those years had known was there. I thought about the woman in Vienna in 1943 who had last seen it. I did not know her name. The restitution researchers would find it, that was their work, and they were already doing it. But I thought about her anyway, the way you think about the beginning of a story, when you have finally reached the end of it. We reached the corner of the street. Soren stopped and looked back at the gallery for a moment, then at me. "What happens now?" he asked. I realized the first time in 14 months that someone had asked me that question, and I had not felt the ground shift beneath it. Now I said, "It goes home."
The formal disassembly took place on a Friday morning in December, 3 weeks after the gallery. The Philadelphia Museum of Art had prepared a conservation suite on the 3rd floor for the occasion, a room I had never been in before, accessible by a service elevator at the east end of the building, with light-filtering blinds on the skylights and a temperature that hovered at precisely 68 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the weather was doing outside. The restitution panel consisted of 7 people, Dr. Hartley, 2 additional conservators from the museum's permanent staff, a representative from the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, a provenance researcher who had flown in from Vienna specifically for the museum's legal counsel, and Remington, who attended not as an investigator but as a formal witness on behalf of the federal case record. Drummond had asked that Isadora and I be present as the appraisers of record. We stood to the left of the main conservation table, close enough to observe at the distance the process required. Soren stood beside me. The work took 4 hours and 12 minutes. I will not describe every step of it. That is what Dr. Hartley's formal documentation is for, and it runs to 63 pages and will eventually be accessible through the museum's archival record. What I will say is that watching a painting reveal itself from beneath a false surface is one of the strangest and most particular experiences I have had in 12 years of this work. It does not happen the way film presents it, no sudden dramatic exposure, no single moment where the concealed image springs fully into view. It happens slowly, a section at a time, a decision at a time, The conservators worked in near silence consulting instruments and each other in low voices, and the painting came forward gradually, the way a face becomes recognizable in low light, not all at once, but in increments, each one irreversible. The first area of the original surface to emerge was in the upper left quadrant, a section of sky or what appeared to be sky in a blue that was different in quality from anything in the symbolist overlay, denser, more deliberate, the kind of blue that takes on weight when you look at it long enough. Dr. Hartley paused and made a notation. The provenance researcher from Vienna leaned forward slightly and then straightened, composing herself. Isadora beside me did not move. It took another 2 hours for the full composition to resolve. When it did, we stood in the temperature-controlled room under the filtered December light and looked at what had been hidden for 80 years, a large format interior scene formally composed, with a quality of light in it that I recognized immediately as belonging to a specific tradition and a specific hand, the kind of work you spend years looking at paintings to be able to recognize, the kind of work that once you have seen it, you do not mistake for anything else. The provenance researcher said the name quietly, almost to herself, as though confirming something she had suspected but had not permitted herself to assume. The room was very still. Drummond had told me the week before what he intended to do with the painting once the restitution process was complete. He told me in the same gallery where we had first unwrapped it, standing near the window with his hands behind his back, in the considered way he approached all decisions that mattered. The painting legally belonged to him. He had acquired it in good faith, and the court had confirmed his title after the evidence review. But legal ownership and moral ownership, he said, were not always the same thing, and he had never confused the two. The restitution researchers had identified the family in Vienna. There were 2 surviving descendants, a woman in her 70s living in Salzburg, and her son, who had been sent the preliminary documentation the week before and had responded within 24 hours. Drummond was returning the painting to them, not selling it, not negotiating, returning it with the full provenance documentation, the conservation record, and a letter he had written himself that I had not read and did not ask to. It was never mine to keep, he said simply. I bought what someone represented to me as an early symbolist work. I did not buy a stolen family painting. Those are different things. I had not said anything. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. The museum has offered to host the formal handover, he added. I thought that was appropriate. A public institution seems right for something that has been private for too long. The handover took place on the last Friday before Christmas. The woman from Salzburg, whose name was Dr. Ingrid Strauss, and who was 73 years old and had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had spent a lifetime in academic work, arrived with her son the day before and spent Thursday morning in the conservation suite with Dr. Hartley, looking at the painting in the particular way that people look at things they have been told about all their lives and are now seeing for the first time. I was not present for that. That was not mine to witness. But I was present for the handover itself, which was a small formal ceremony in one of the museum's smaller galleries, not a public event, not a press occasion. Though there would be a press release afterward, and eventually I was told an exhibition. It was attended by Drummond Dr. Hartley Remington Soren and Isadora and Dr. Strauss and her son and me, and no one else. Drummond signed the transfer document. Dr. Strauss signed below his name. They shook hands, and then, after a moment, she said something to him in German that I did not speak well enough to follow, and he nodded as though he understood it completely. The painting hung on the wall behind them, properly lit now the way it was meant to be lit. The composition visible in full for the first time in a room that was not a storage vault or a crime scene or a conservation suite, but simply a room where people had come to look at it. The blue in the upper left quadrant that I had first seen emerging under Dr. Hartley's instruments was different again in this light, quieter and more certain of itself, the way things are when they have finally arrived where they are supposed to be. Isadora stood beside me. She was looking at the painting. Your grandmother described it correctly, I said quietly. She did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was even. She said it looked like a window into a world that no longer existed, Isadora said. I used to think that meant something sad. She paused. I think now she meant that the world in the painting was complete in itself, that it did not need anything from the outside. Another pause. That it had always been enough. It just needed to be seen. I looked at the painting. I thought she was right. We walked out of the museum into the December afternoon, Isadora and I, Soren, a half step behind, the way he had been at the gallery corner 3 weeks before, when he had asked what happens now. The light was low and pale, the kind of winter light that makes the city look like a photograph of itself, and the museum steps were cold under our feet. Soren fell into step beside me. I've been offered a position, he said after a moment. At the museum, Conservation and Provenance Research. He said it carefully in the way of someone presenting a fact and leaving room for a response. In Philadelphia, I said. In Philadelphia, he confirmed. I thought about that. 14 months ago, I had been sitting in a dark nursery at 2 a.m. with a 3-week-old baby and a phone that had just buzzed with a message from a number I barely recognized. I had not known then what any of it meant. I had only known that I was not entirely alone. That seems right, I said. He nodded. We walked down the steps into the December afternoon, and the city moved around us the way it always did, continuous, indifferent, and entirely unaware that something had just been returned to the world that had been missing from it for 80 years. Behind us, through the museum walls, the painting hung in its quiet room and did what paintings do when no one is looking at them. It waited, patiently, the way it always had. I'm not a cautionary tale, but I will not pretend this was unavoidable. Family betrayal does not arrive loudly. It comes quietly, a familiar statement slipped in while you are busy, a voice assuring you that everything is fine when nothing is fine at all. I stopped asking questions because I trusted completely. That was my mistake, and I take responsibility for it. Do not let love become the reason you stop seeing things clearly. God gave us discernment for a reason. Use it even when it is uncomfortable, even when the person in front of you is the one you chose to build a life with. What I experienced was the most silent and calculated form of family betrayal. And what carried me through was not revenge, but truth, patience, and the willingness to let the people who truly love me help. Walter, Odette, Isadora, Drummond, Soren. I did not get through this alone. No one does. Revenge will close every door. Truth will open opportunities. That is the only lesson I know how to pass on. And if right now you are somewhere carrying the weight of family betrayal, know that the evidence still exists. The truth can be found. Revenge is never the answer. But justice, quiet and unhurried, is almost always the right one. Thank you for your patience in following along. If Josephine's story resonates with you, leave a comment. What would you do if you were in her position? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. This story is inspired by broader social themes, with some elements adjusted for storytelling purposes. If this topic is not suitable for you, feel free to explore other videos.
I appreciate you watching this with me. I will see you in the next story.